Every morning, the silence was the first thing to greet me, thick and unyielding like a shroud. It pressed down from the high ceilings of my rented flat, seeped from the closed-off rooms I no longer entered. I'd rise, always before dawn, the habit ingrained from a life that had in every meaningful way ceased to exist. The ritual was unvarying, strong, black coffee, brewed in a French press that hummed its low, lonely song. The same worn armchair by the window overlooking the city's indifferent sprawl, the blank page in my sketchbook. I used to fill pages with lines and angles, with the promise of homes that hummed with life. Now they remained empty, a testament to the gaping void inside me. My hands, once so sure with a pencil, sometimes trembled. Not visibly, not to an observer, but I felt the tremor deep in the bones, a constant echo of the fire. Always the fire. 3 years. 3 years since the smoke had curled into the night sky, since the roar had swallowed everything I held dear. My wife, my daughter, gone, in the house I had designed. My masterpiece, they called it, a perfect blend of modern aesthetic and passive energy efficiency. A tomb. The blueprints, meticulously drawn, still burned in my mind's eye. Every beam, every joist, every wiring conduit. I knew that house better than I knew myself. And yet, when the flames had danced, when the timbers had groaned, when the screams had died, I had been helpless, standing outside watching it consume them. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in my gut growing heavier with each passing sunrise. It never lessened, never softened. It simply was. I had tried to work for a while. A colleague, bless his well-meaning heart, had offered me a small renovation project, a kitchen extension for a young couple. The sight of their hopeful faces, discussing countertop materials and cabinet finishes, had been too much. I saw my wife's smile in the wife's eagerness, heard my daughter's laughter in the child's distant squeals from the garden. I'd walked out, leaving the colleague to make my excuses. My office, once a vibrant space of creativity and collaboration, was now just a collection of dust-covered models and forgotten dreams. I paid the rent, barely, from the few remaining savings, a testament to a life I no longer deserved. The only place I still found a semblance of peace, a fragile, fleeting calm, was in the old stone chapel on the edge of the city. It was a place few frequented, especially now. I'd found it during one of my aimless walks, drawn by its quiet dignity, its air of ancient, forgotten sorrow. It was a chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light, their tiny flames dancing in the cavernous gloom like scattered embers. The air inside was cool, perpetually still, carrying the faint, mingled scent of old wax, dust, and something else. A whisper of incense long burned, of prayers long uttered. I didn't pray, I just existed. It was during one of these solitary vigils that the letter found me, not literally, of course. It had arrived at my flat, a heavy, cream-colored envelope, thick with an unfamiliar wax seal depicting a crest I didn't recognize. The return address was that of a solicitor's firm, one I'd never heard of, located in a remote, almost forgotten corner of the country. I'd opened it with a peculiar sense of detachment, as if it belonged to someone else. The contents were brief, formal, almost curt. It spoke of a distant relative, a great aunt I'd never known existed who had recently passed. It spoke of an estate. It spoke of me, Raj, being named the sole heir. An ancestral home. My family on both sides had always been city dwellers, academics, professionals. We had no ancestral home, no sprawling estate. The idea was absurd. Yet the letter was precise, detailing an address, a remote village nestled deep in the countryside, miles from anything familiar. The solicitor, a dry, precise woman with spectacles perched on her nose, had called a few days later. Her voice, devoid of emotion, confirmed the letter's contents. The property has been in your family for generations, Mr. Sharma. Your great-aunt lived there her entire life. She left everything to you. But you are the last remaining direct descendant of that particular branch. She stipulated that the family line should continue and the house remain in the family name. Family line. The words tasted bitter. My family line had ended in a blaze of glory, hadn't it? The solicitor had then gone on to describe the house in vague, almost dismissive terms. It's rather old, dilapidated, I believe is the appropriate word. It will require significant work, but it is yours. Significant work. The thought of designing anything, let alone renovating an old, unfamiliar house, sent a shiver down my spine. I was an architect who could no longer build. I was a man who had lost everything, now inexplicably handed something new, something ancient. I had traveled to the chapel immediately after the call, seeking the familiar solace of its dimness. The altar candles flickered, each tiny flame a fragile heartbeat in the vast quiet. The air, usually a comfort, felt heavy now, pregnant with unspoken things. This ancestral home, it was an anchor dragging me back into a past I didn't know, to a family I'd never met. Or was it a lifeline, a chance to rebuild, even if only a structure of stone and mortar? The thought was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by a deeper, more primal unease. Why had my great-aunt, a woman I knew nothing about, chosen me, and what kind of secrets did an ancestral home so stubbornly hold deep in the forgotten countryside? I had traveled to the chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light, their tiny flames shivering against the vast, oppressive quiet. The air, thick with old incense and dust, had felt heavier than usual, pressing down on my chest until each breath was a shallow effort. I left that place with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, a fragile determination to face whatever awaited me. The legalities were done. The old house was mine. The drive to the ancestral home was a blur of gray asphalt and rain-streaked windows. The landscape grew wilder, trees leaning in like conspirators, their bare branches scratching against the sky. The GPS, a modern anomaly in this ancient world, finally announced my arrival. No grand gates, no manicured drive, just a break in a crumbling stone wall, barely wide enough for my car, leading onto a track swallowed by overgrown weeds. The house loomed at the end of it, a silhouette against the bruised afternoon sky. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, its stone walls stained with centuries of weather, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from under heavy brows of ivy. The roof sagged in places, a tired spine. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't solace. This was an obligation, a monument to a past I barely knew, yet somehow felt bound to. I cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, save for the drip of water from the eaves and the distant caw of a crow. My hands, clammy, gripped the steering wheel. Stepping out, the air bit at my face, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. I dismissed it as imagination, a trick of the mind after too many sleepless nights. The front door, a heavy oak slab studded with iron, groaned in protest as I pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that penetrated the grimy windows. My footsteps echoed, each one a sharp report in the cavernous hall. It felt strangely smooth, despite its age, almost polished. My luggage, a couple of duffel bags and a box of essentials, seemed woefully inadequate for filling this sprawling, desolate place. I found what I assumed was the main living area, a vast room with a fireplace large enough to stand inside. The furniture, shrouded in white sheets, looked like ghosts awaiting resurrection. Pulling the sheets off an armchair, a cloud of dust erupted, making me cough. I sank into the velvet, feeling the years of neglect seep into my bones. I started small, unpacking my few clothes into a wardrobe in what I decided would be my bedroom. The room was at the front of the house, overlooking the overgrown drive. It was less imposing than the others, with a smaller fireplace and a window that actually let in some light. As I folded a shirt, a faint scratching sound started. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch. It seemed to come from inside the walls, a rhythmic, persistent gnawing. Mice, I told myself, old houses have mice. I stopped, listening harder. The sound paused when I did. When I resumed folding, it started again, not exactly in sync, but close enough to make me feel watched. I walked to the wall, pressing my ear against the cool plaster. Nothing. I pulled back, shaking my head. Tiredness, that's all it was, my mind playing tricks. I decided to explore the kitchen next. It was a cavernous space dominated by an ancient cast-iron range. The cupboards were empty, save for a few cobweb-draped jars. I opened a lower cupboard, peering into the gloom. A faint smell, like something sweet and rotten, wafted out. I wrinkled my nose, pulling back. As I reached to close the door, my fingers brushed against something. A small wooden toy, a child's spinning top, painted in faded blues and yellows. It was impossibly old, its paint chipped and worn smooth by countless tiny hands. I picked it up, turning it over in my palm. Where had it come from? The cupboard had been empty moments before. I was certain. I had scanned every inch, looking for signs of vermin. My breath hitched. It wasn't there, then it was. I stared at the toy, then back into the empty cupboard. Had I simply missed it? Was it tucked away in a corner I hadn't properly seen? I tried to convince myself to rationalize it away. I placed the spinning top on the counter, its colors stark against the grimy stone. I could feel it, a presence, a weight in the air that hadn't been there before, or perhaps it had, and I was only now beginning to notice. I walked back to the living room, drawn by a sudden urge to see the armchair again. The white sheet lay crumpled on the floor where I had tossed it, but the armchair itself, it looked different. My heart began to beat a little faster. Was it just the light playing tricks? I left that place with a strange, heavy quiet clinging to me, a silence far more unsettling than any noise. The chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light, had offered no solace, only amplified the hollowness inside. The drive back to the ancestral home felt longer than usual. The afternoon light, muted by an overcast sky, cast everything in a drab, uniform gray. I gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight, a dull ache throbbing behind my eyes. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, haunted by the lingering scent of smoke and the image of my family's faces. The guilt, a constant companion, felt particularly sharp after the chapel's suffocating stillness. Stepping through the front door of the house, I expected the familiar scent of damp earth and decaying wood, a comfort in its predictability. Instead, a faint, sickly sweet aroma, like overblown lilies left too long in stagnant water, prickled at my nose. I paused, inhaling deeply, trying to place it, but it dissipated as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the usual mustiness. My imagination, I told myself, a trick of the mind after too many sleepless nights. I walked through the empty rooms, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I frowned, a flicker of irritation replacing the unease. Forgetfulness. It had to be. Later in the study, I tried to immerse myself in old architectural plans, hoping the precise lines and calculations would ground me. The house groaned around me, the familiar settling sounds that I usually dismissed as the natural complaints of an old structure. Tonight, each creak, each shudder felt deliberate, weighted with intent. A distinct shushing sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, drifted from the hallway. I froze, pen hovering over a blueprint. No wind could penetrate the thick walls here. I strained my ears, but the sound didn't repeat. My shoulders tensed. "Just the house," I muttered, my voice thin and reedy in the vast quiet. It wasn't a draft. It was a pocket of unnatural frigidity that seemed to move with me. Settling on my back, then on my arm, gooseflesh rose. I pulled my cardigan tighter. It wasn't a word, not exactly, but a soft, sibilant sigh like someone breathing my name. "Raj," my breath caught in my throat. I spun around my chair, scraping harshly against the floor. Nothing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. My hands started to tremble, the pen clattering to the desk. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The sound seemed to be swallowed whole by the room, leaving no echo. I could feel it pressing against my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. A heavy book, a thick tome on ancient Roman architecture, slid off a shelf in the corner with a soft thud, landing upright on the floor, its pages splayed open. This wasn't the house settling. This wasn't my imagination. A book doesn't simply slide off a shelf and land perfectly upright. I stared at it, my mind racing, desperate for a rational explanation. A faulty shelf, a tremor I hadn't felt, it felt orchestrated. My palms were slick with sweat. I took a shaky step towards the book, then another. It was too quick, too fluid, too wrong to be real. My mind reeled. Was I losing my grip? The grief, the guilt, the exhaustion, they were potent toxins. Had I finally succumbed to them? There was this ancestral home, a place meant for solace, merely amplifying my internal turmoil, manifesting my fears into tangible, terrifying experiences. Or was it something else entirely, something that fed on the very despair I was trying so desperately to escape? There was either source of this escalating horror, or merely its unwitting host. My hands started to tremble, a fine tremor that quickly escalated into a violent shiver. I clenched them into fists, digging my nails into my palms, trying to anchor myself in the now. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the frantic thump of my own pulse in my ears. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I hadn't imagined it. That distinct, wet thud had been real, but what had caused it? I forced myself to breathe slow and deep, the way the therapist had taught me after the fire. Rationalize, Raj. Look for the angles, the supports, the stress points. My architectural training, my lifelong defense against the chaotic, began to assert itself. This house was old, yes, but it was still a structure. Every creak, every groan, every unsettling sensation had to have a source. A draft, settling foundations, vermin. I clung to these possibilities like a drowning man to driftwood. Sleep was impossible. I needed to move, to investigate, to find a logical explanation before the illogical consumed me entirely. My mind, a frantic blueprint, started to piece together fragments of the house's history I'd gleaned from the estate papers. An old chapel, tucked away in the rarely visited West Wing, mentioned as a place of quiet contemplation, long unused. It was almost midnight when I finally reached the chapel doors. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, each protest echoing in the profound stillness. The heavy oak doors, studded with rusted iron, gave a drawn-out shriek as I pushed them open. The air was thick with the scent of ancient dust, damp stone, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten iron and dried blood. My breath plumed visible in the frigid air. It was a space designed for solemnity, but now it felt like a tomb. My architectural eye immediately began its survey. The stone walls, thick and unyielding, seemed to absorb all sound. The stained glass windows, depicting obscure saints, were grimy and fractured, allowing no moonlight in. Everything here felt solid, permanent, yet also wrong. I noticed the acoustics first. This wasn't typical for a stone room of this size. It suggested an unusual density, perhaps even hidden chambers within the walls. I began to tap systematically, methodically, moving from one end of the chapel to the other, my knuckles rapping against the cold stone. Most sections gave a dull, solid thud. But as I neared the altar, specifically the wall to its left, a subtle change occurred. Tap, tap, thud, solid, thump, thump. My heart gave a lurch. I tapped again, thump, thump. It was a fraction of a difference, barely perceptible, but to my trained ear it was undeniable, a different resonance. The stone here, though visually identical to the surrounding blocks, sounded thinner, or perhaps there was an empty space directly behind it. I ran my fingers along the mortar lines, searching for any seam, any irregularity. Then I felt it. It wasn't coming from the windows, nor the door I'd just entered through. I pressed my ear against the cold stone, nothing but the faint roar of blood in my own ears. I traced the mortar lines again, more carefully this time, my fingers seeking any give. My gaze swept over the stonework, searching for pattern and anomaly. And there it was, almost imperceptible, a tiny, almost invisible hairline crack, tracing a perfect vertical line down one of the larger stones, barely visible even in the direct glow of a candle I held close. It wasn't a natural crack. It was too straight, too precise. It suggested a seam. It formed a rectangle almost perfectly aligned with the altar. This wasn't a structural flaw, it was an access point, a hidden door. I pushed, gently at first, then with more force. Nothing. I felt along the edges again, pressing, probing. Then, my thumb brushed against a small, almost flush indentation in the stone, no bigger than a fingernail. I pressed it. With a soft, grinding sigh that seemed to echo from deep within the earth, the section of wall pivoted inward, revealing a narrow, pitch-black cavity, something ancient, metallic, and cloying. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. What was hidden behind this silent stone, and what was that smell? My heart gave a lurch. I tapped again. A hollowness. Stone here, though visually identical to the surrounding blocks, sounded thinner, or perhaps there was an empty space behind it. My fingers, still gritty from the dust of the previous room, traced the cold surface, searching for any seam, any give. The wall felt solid, impossibly so, yet the sound told a different story. I pressed harder, my thumb dragging across a faint indentation. It was a hairline crack, barely visible, running vertically down the center of one of the blocks. I remembered the meticulous craftsmanship of the original builders, how every joint was meant to be flawless. This was an imperfection, or perhaps a deliberate concealment. I ran my nail along it, feeling a slight catch. Not a natural fissure in the stone, but a cut. Precise, calculated, my breath hitched. I pushed against the stone, then pulled, then wiggled. Nothing. It was stubborn, unyielding. A faint, earthy smell, like damp soil and old paper, seemed to waft from the stone itself. It was almost imperceptible, lost in the general mustiness of the house, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsmell it. A tremor went through me, not of fear, not yet, but of anticipation. I was getting closer to something. I pulled my utility knife from my pocket, the one I used for opening paint cans and scoring blueprints. The blade was too thick for the hairline crack, but the tip of the handle, a hardened plastic, might work. I wedged it into the seam and twisted gently. The stone block, no larger than a shoebox, didn't slide out immediately. It recessed inward by a fraction of an inch, then pivoted on an unseen hinge. A gust of stale, cloying air, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something sickly sweet and metallic, washed over me. My stomach churned. It was too deep for the faint light of the hallway to penetrate fully, but I could make out shapes. Bundles, papers, a small, tarnished metal box. My fingers brushed against brittle paper, then something soft, like aged cloth. I pulled out a stack of yellowed, bound journals, their leather covers cracked and flaking. Beneath them, a velvet-wrapped bundle, and finally, the small, ornate metal box. I couldn't examine them properly in the gloom. The hallway felt too exposed, too open. I needed light, and I needed privacy. My gaze drifted towards the chapel, the only room I knew of where I could guarantee a measure of both. The heavy oak door of the chapel groaned as I pushed it open. The flames, impossibly steady for a house so prone to inexplicable drafts, painted the stone walls in hues of gold and amber, leaving the corners in an impenetrable gloom. The scent of beeswax and old incense hung heavy, mixing with the musty odor clinging to the journals in my hands. I set the journals, the velvet bundle, and the metal box on the altar, the cold stone biting into my palms. The candlelight illuminated the faded script on the topmost journal's cover, The Sorrows of the House of Blackwood. My family name. My stomach tightened. I picked up the first journal, its pages thin and brittle. The handwriting was spidery, elegant, yet filled with a frantic energy. The first entry was dated 1888. She detailed sleepless nights, a pervasive sense of despair that seemed to deepen with each passing day. "It feeds," she'd scrawled in a later entry, "on my tears, on my endless regret." My eyes widened. "Feeds." I flipped through the pages, scanning for similar phrases. Then another, a generation later, a man describing the unbearable burden after his wife's slow decline and death, how his guilt over his inability to save her grew into a palpable presence. "It watches me," he wrote, "waiting for the grief to ripen." My breath caught in my throat. Ripen, grief, guilt. My own overwhelming sorrow for my lost family, the gnawing guilt over the house I designed, the one that burned. It was all here. The words on the page were an echo of my own tortured thoughts, my own crushing despair. This wasn't just a house. It was a trap. My gaze snapped to the velvet bundle. I unwrapped it with shaking fingers. Inside, nestled in the faded cloth, was a child's porcelain doll, its painted eyes wide and unblinking. One arm was broken, its delicate ceramic shards still clinging to the fabric. A wave of nausea washed over me. My children, their toys, the image of the charred remains of their belongings flashed in my mind. Then the metal box. It was heavy, intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. It sprang open with a soft click. Inside, not jewels, not money, but a single, desiccated human heart. It was small, shriveled, almost black, perfectly preserved in some forgotten method. This wasn't just a house of sorrow. It was a charnel house for it. The entity, whatever it was, didn't just haunt. It consumed. It devoured the very essence of human despair. And I, with my bottomless well of grief and guilt, had walked right into its maw. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the box. The air in the chapel grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I was not just a guest in this house. I was the main course, and it had been waiting for me. What would it do now that it knew I knew? It wasn't just a house. It was a maw, a gaping, cavernous mouth, and I was the feast. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, shaking the very bones in my chest. Ripen, grief, guilt. My family, the fire, the architectural plans I'd drawn, the ones that had sealed their fate, it was all here, laid bare in the ancient script, reflected in my own tormented mind. This place wasn't just haunted by something, it was the something, and it fed on the very despair that had become my constant companion. A cold dread, far deeper than any I'd felt before, wrapped around me. This wasn't a spectral whisper or a fleeting shadow. This was a trap, meticulously laid, and I was caught. My breath hitched. I needed to get out. Now, I bolted from the study, the heavy tome still open on the desk, its revelations burning behind my eyes. Each floorboard creaked under my frantic steps, a chorus of groans that seemed to mock my haste. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I pushed myself faster, a desperate urgency propelling me towards the front door. I had to reach it, had to feel the cool, clean air of the outside world on my face. I pulled. It held fast. I pulled harder, muscles straining, sweat beading on my forehead. The wood of the door frame seemed to flex, to resist, as if it had taken root. A faint, cloying scent like old roses left to rot filled my nostrils. I heard a low groan, not from the wood, but from within the walls, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floor and up my legs. Panic flared. I slammed my shoulder against the door once, twice. The old timber shuddered but didn't budge. It was locked, not just locked, but sealed. I spun around, my gaze darting wildly. Windows, there had to be windows. I raced through the sitting room, tripping over a forgotten rug, my hands outstretched. The tall, arched windows, usually letting in slivers of weak sunlight, were now opaque, coated in a thick, greasy grime that hadn't been there moments ago. I clawed at the glass, my fingernails scraping uselessly. It felt like trying to see through mud. No response. Just the distant, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the building. I wouldn't surrender, not yet. I remembered a small, rarely used side exit near the old chapel, a place I'd barely glanced at since arriving. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but I had to try. My feet pounded against the floorboards, a frantic rhythm against the house's silent judgment. I could almost taste the dampness, the ancient dust. I pushed open the heavy, peeling door to the chapel. The hinges shrieked in protest, a sound like a tortured animal. This was the chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light, a place that now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of old wax and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like rust and drying blood. My eyes scanned the perimeter, searching for the small, almost hidden door I remembered. There it was, tucked away behind a crumbling confessional booth, barely visible in the shifting gloom. Hope surged, a fragile, desperate thing. I stumbled towards it, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. It was a simple latch, old and rusted, but it should open. I grasped the cold metal, my grip tight. It didn't move. I pulled harder, gritting my teeth, putting my full weight into it. The latch groaned, threatened to give, but remained steadfast. It was stuck, permanently. Then, a low thrum vibrated through the floor, rising in intensity until it felt like a giant bell tolling deep within the earth. The very walls around me seemed to ripple, the stone blocks shifting, settling, groaning under an unseen pressure. Dust, thick and choking, rained down from the ceiling. I stumbled back, my hands flying up to cover my face. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, stealing my breath. The small, hidden door I'd been trying to open seemed to melt, its outlines blurring, the wood warping and twisting until it became an indistinguishable part of the solid stone wall. There was no door there anymore, just seamless, impenetrable rock. A gasp tore from my lungs. The house wasn't just old, it wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was changing itself, physically altering its structure to keep me within its grasp. It had heard my desperation, felt my need to escape, and responded with an undeniable, terrifying display of power. My legs gave out. The altar candles dimmed once more, returning to their feeble, mocking flicker. I was trapped, utterly, irrevocably trapped, but why? What did it want from me now that it had me? The house pulsed, not with a rhythmic beat, but with a slow, consuming throb that vibrated through the floorboards, up my legs, and settled in my teeth. Ripen, grief, guilt. My family, the fire, the architectural plans I'd drawn, the ones that had sealed their fate, it all made a terrible, sickening sense. I was being prepared. A cold dread, far deeper than any chill in the damp air, seeped into my core. My breath hitched. I needed answers. Not vague, whispering hints, but solid, undeniable truths. My gaze, frantic and desperate, swept across the familiar, yet suddenly alien hallway. The ancestral portraits, their eyes following me with a silent accusation, seemed to sag deeper into their frames. They weren't just ancestors, they were complicit. The path led me to the chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light. The heavy oak door creaked open, groaning in protest, as if guarding a secret it never wanted to share. Inside, the gloom was absolute, broken only by the feeble, flickering orange glow of a dozen altar candles. The air was frigid, biting at my exposed skin, and carried the heavy, cloying smell of extinguished wicks and something else, something fetid and sweet, like decay hidden beneath layers of incense. The only sound was the faint, desperate crackle of the candle wicks. My eyes, adjusting to the dim light, darted around the small, forgotten space. Dust motes, thick as fog, danced in the weak light, illuminated by the struggling flames. This chapel felt less like a place of worship and more like a tomb. At the altar, beneath a tarnished crucifix, lay a stack of old, leather-bound ledgers. They were bound with brittle, sun-faded twine and covered in a fine layer of dust. My fingers, trembling slightly, reached for the topmost book. I brushed away the dust, revealing faded gold lettering, "The House of Rajan Deeds and Offerings." Rajan, my family name, my bloodline. I opened the ledger. The pages, yellowed and fragile, crackled like dry leaves. The script, an elegant, spidery hand, filled the first page. It wasn't a financial record. It was a chronicle, a horrifying genealogy of misfortune. Each entry detailed a death, a loss, a tragedy within my family line stretching back generations. The merchant lost at sea, guilt of stolen cargo. The matriarch succumbed to fever, grief of a child's passing unmourned. The architect ruined by his own design, shame of a faulty foundation. My breath hitched. The words blurred before my eyes, then sharpened into sickening clarity. Each entry described not just a death, but the emotion that preceded it. Guilt, shame, fear. The very emotions the house now sought to cultivate in me. The entity wasn't just drawn to these feelings, it fed on them, it thrived on them. A small, almost imperceptible symbol was drawn next to it, a twisted knot resembling a noose, or perhaps a family crest distorted. And beneath it, in a different hand, a more recent, frantic script, the architect's plans, a perfect conduit, the final harvest, the bloodline's reckoning. His grief will be the feast, his guilt the offering, the chosen sacrifice. The chosen sacrifice. My family hadn't simply suffered misfortunes, they had been harvested. My family's legacy wasn't just a house, it was a ritual, a generational sacrifice. And I, Raj, the architect of my own tragedy, was the final, ripened offering. My hands, still clutching the ledger, began to shake violently. The altar candles flickered, their tiny flames elongating, dancing wildly as if caught in an unseen gale. The smell of decay intensified, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just the house's hunger I felt now. It was the accumulated weight of centuries of sin, of pain, of blood. The pages of the ledger seemed to hum, vibrating with an ancient malevolence. They were the very foundation of this entity. I was not just a victim, stumbling into a haunted house. I was the culmination, the carefully selected instrument for its ultimate sustenance. My grief over my family's death, my guilt over the fire, my role in their demise, it was all part of a grand, horrific design that stretched back further than I could comprehend. The truth, stark and brutal, stared back at me from the crumbling pages. This wasn't a haunting, it was an inheritance. And the price of that inheritance was my very soul. But if it was a cycle, a ritual, could it be broken? Could a design, however ancient, be undone? The cold pronouncement had stripped me bare, harvested. My family, their lives, their deaths, reduced to a grim ledger entry, a meticulously cultivated crop for some unseen horror. The words echoed not just in the chapel's silence, but in the hollow space where my heart used to be. Fury, a desperate, burning need to understand, to fight, to tear apart the delicate, terrible tapestry woven through generations. I would not be another sacrifice. The chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light, felt like a tomb, a moor. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of old wax, damp stone, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like spilled copper left to oxidize. I tasted dust on my tongue and the phantom tang of old blood. My gaze swept across the ancient stones, no longer seeing just a building, but a trap. A mechanism. Every arch, every pillar, every stained glass pane suddenly felt like a component in a vast, malevolent machine. My architect's eye, usually so keen to beauty and structure, now saw only function. What was this chapel's true purpose? Not just worship, not just burial, something far more sinister. I walked the perimeter, my boots scuffing softly on the flagstones. I felt for seams, for subtle shifts in the masonry, for any deviation from the expected pattern. My breath hitched. The stone here, near the base of the altar, felt different, smoother, almost polished despite its age. And there, a faint, almost imperceptible line, a hairline fracture in the mortar where none should be, a seam. My heart began a slow, heavy thrum against my ribs. Not panic, not yet. A different kind of fear, sharp and focused, like a surgeon's scalpel. I pressed harder, running my palm across the section of stone. It wasn't just a seam, it was a panel. A hidden door, camouflaged with meticulous, horrifying skill. This wasn't some haphazard hiding place. This was deliberate, designed. I leaned in, my ear pressed against the cold stone, straining to hear anything beyond the crackle of the altar candles. Nothing. My fingers fumbled for purchase, searching for a latch, a handle, a pressure plate. The stone was unforgiving, seamless to the touch. But I was an architect. I understood mechanisms, counterweights, pivot points. This wasn't just a wall, it was an entry. It stood like a silent sentinel, its surface scarred with centuries of ritual and neglect. I noticed a slight misalignment in the floor tiles directly in front of it, a subtle shift in the pattern. I knelt, scraping away decades of grime with my fingernail. Beneath the dirt, a faint symbol emerged, etched into the stone. Not a cross, not any familiar religious iconography. It was a complex series of interlocking triangles, each point ending in a stylized thorny barb, and in the center a single weeping eye. The symbol pulsed in the dim candlelight, almost seeming to glow. This wasn't just decoration, this was a key. I pressed my thumb against the weeping eye. I tried again, pressing harder, leaning my weight into it. Still nothing. Frustration, hot and bitter, flared within me. I was so close, so agonizingly close to understanding. It wasn't dirt. It was dried, old blood. My stomach clenched. I pulled back my hand, wiping it instinctively on my trousers, though there was nothing there. The thought of what had been done here, what had been spilled, made the chapel air feel even heavier, suffocating. What if it wasn't a pressure plate? What if it needed something else? Something more. My eyes darted to the altar candles, the only source of light, their flames dancing like tiny, trapped spirits. The heat from them was surprisingly intense, radiating outwards, warming the air directly above the altar. I looked at the symbol again, at the weeping eye, at the thorny barbs. A ritual. This was a ritual chamber. I remembered the old texts the estate manager had mentioned, locked away in the study, the ones he'd warned me against. They hadn't just built houses, they had built prisons, and this chapel. This was the heart of it. I stood, my gaze fixed on the symbol. Then on the hidden panel. There had to be a connection, a sequence, a specific action. I ran my hand over the altar again, searching. My fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation on the side of the marble slab, just beneath the lip. It was a shallow groove, perfectly sized for a single finger, and it was warm, warmer than the surrounding stone. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, to forget everything I had seen. My family had been harvested, and I was next. No, not me. I would not be a victim. I would understand. I would fight. I pressed my finger into the warm indentation. Then a low rumble, deep and resonant, vibrated through the flagstones beneath my feet. The smell that wafted out was ancient, heavy and metallic, far stronger than before. It was the scent of something long dormant, now stirring. And what would I find when I stepped inside? Grief still clung to me, a suffocating shroud, but the word harvested had seared through it, leaving a cold, clear space. My family reduced to a crop. The absurdity of it, the chilling pragmatism, was a new kind of horror. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every faint drip of moisture from the unseen ceiling felt amplified, a whisper in the vast, echoing silence. My breath hitched. My hands, still clenched from the previous revelation, began to tremble. This wasn't just a monster that fed, it was a farmer of souls. And I, with my family's tragedy, was standing in its fields. The idea was grotesque, a perversion of life itself. It was resolve, a terrible, burning resolve. If my family had been a crop, then I would be the blight, the wildfire. It was a soft, almost hesitant sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone. My head snapped up, eyes straining against the gloom. It was a woman's voice, but aged, stripped of warmth. The nature of the soil. My skin crawled. I hadn't seen anyone, heard anyone approach. The chapel during lockdown, altar candles' only light should have been empty. She carried a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed and dog-eared, tucked under one arm. This was the chronicler, I realized, the keeper of records. I am merely. The ledger holds the names, the dates, the yields. She gestured with a skeletal hand towards the altar, then to the entire chapel, a slow, sweeping motion that encompassed everything. I call it grief, we call it cultivation. My stomach clenched. Cultivation? What are I talking about? She took a slow, shuffling step forward, then another, until he was standing in the aisle, still far from me, but closer than I liked. The candlelight caught the sheen of her eyes, making them glint. The seed of despair, it must be planted with care, nurtured. Sometimes a gentle breeze of misfortune, sometimes a storm. Sudden, devastating fire, perhaps. The words struck me like physical blows. A sudden, devastating fire, my family, the guilt, the grief, the years of self-recrimination, all of it had been carefully orchestrated. Not an accident, not a tragic flaw in my design, but a deliberate act. It was an accident. The chronicler offered a dry, humorless chuckle. Accidents are merely opportune moments, the right conditions for growth. Your guilt, Raj, your profound, aching guilt, it was a fertilizer beyond measure. It fed the root system, deep, strong, a rich harvest indeed. She tapped the ledger. Your family, their lives, their deaths, they were not wasted. Nothing is wasted. My hands balled into fists, nails digging into my palms. This wasn't just about feeding. This was about manipulation, about orchestrating human tragedy for some unfathomable, monstrous purpose. They didn't just wait for sorrow, they created it. They didn't just consume, they designed the very circumstances that led to the feast. And you, I spat, finding my voice again, though it trembled with fury. Are you a farmer too, a harvester? Her gaze, flat and unblinking, met mine. I am merely a chronicler. I record the cycles, the planting, the tending, the reaping. The entity requires diligence, order, a proper accounting. She opened the ledger with a soft crackle of aged paper. It ensures the continuity of the process for centuries, millennia even. Your lineage has been particularly fruitful. My lineage, my ancestral home. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. My family wasn't just a random target. We were a legacy of grief, a well-tended field passed down through generations. My very existence, my inheritance, my return to that house, it had all been part of the long game. What do you want from me? I demanded. Voice raw, the chronicler closed the ledger with a soft thud. You are still in the field, Raj. The harvest is not yet complete. The deepest grief, the most profound despair, those are the sweetest fruits. The chapel with its altar candles only light no longer felt like a sanctuary but a cage. I was trapped not just by physical barriers, but by an unseen force that had woven my entire life into its horrifying design. My family's deaths, my crushing guilt, my very presence here, all of it had been carefully orchestrated. How could I fight something that had already written my story, that had planted the seeds of my destruction before I was even born? What desperate act could possibly uproot such an ancient, insidious evil, my family's dark legacy? The words echoed, not just in the air of the chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light, but deep within my chest, a cold, heavy stone. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between my throat and my lungs. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the scent of old wax and dust filling my nostrils. My vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing to the tiny, struggling lights. This wasn't a sanctuary, it was a holding pen. I was trapped, not just by the locked doors and the unseen force that had woven my entire life into its horrifying design, but by my own inaction, my own fear. I had run from this house, from my past, from my guilt for too long. Now there was nowhere left to go. The chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light, had offered a false sense of security. Now it was just another stage in this twisted play. I looked at the altar, the simple wooden cross, the row of flickering wicks. A strange resolve began to coalesce in the pit of my stomach, a hard knot of determination replacing the churning fear. I was done being a victim. I was done being a pawn. If this entity, this house wanted me, it would have to face me. My gaze drifted lower, to the stone steps leading up to the altar, then to the worn flagstones of the chapel floor. There had to be something more. This house always had secrets, always had hidden places. My hands, still trembling, reached out to the rough stone wall beside the altar. The stone felt ancient, impregnated with centuries of forgotten prayers and unspoken sins. I pressed harder, my knuckles aching. It wasn't words, just a suggestion of sound, a phantom presence. It was trying to distract me, to break my focus. But the determination held. I wouldn't let it. My fingers brushed against a section of the wall that felt slightly different, not perfectly flush with the rest. A faint line, almost invisible, ran down the length of it. It was a joint. I pushed, then pulled, then pushed again, my breath held tight in my chest. Nothing. I tried again, pressing my entire palm against the stone, pushing with all my might. A low groan echoed from somewhere deep within the wall, a sound like old bones shifting. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a section of the wall began to give way, sliding inward with a grating sound that reverberated through the chapel. The scent that wafted out was a punch to the gut, not just dust and mildew, but something cloying, sweet, and deeply unpleasant, like rotting flowers mixed with stale blood. It was the smell of forgotten despair, of trapped memories. It plunged into absolute blackness, deeper than any shadow cast by the altar candles. This was it. This was the way down. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to seal the passage and never look back. But the image of my family, their faces blurred by smoke and time, flashed in my mind. I owed them this. I owed myself this. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the foul air filling my lungs. I stepped forward, pushing through the opening. The last glimpse I had was of the altar candles, their tiny flames still flickering before they vanished entirely. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else, a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I reached out, my hands finding rough, damp stone on either side. The passage was narrow, forcing me to turn sideways in places. My shoes crunched on something gritty and uneven underfoot. Was it just dirt or something more sinister? I moved forward blindly, one hand trailing along the wall, the other stretched out in front of me, bracing for whatever lay ahead. I couldn't see my own hand, even if I held it inches from my face. The sounds of the house, even the distant wind, were completely muffled. The passage sloped downward, a slow, relentless descent into the earth. I could feel moisture on the stone walls, a slimy film that coated my fingertips. My imagination, always my greatest tormentor, began to conjure shapes in the unseen blackness, grasping hands, leering faces, the distorted images of my loved ones consumed by fire. Then a faint, almost imperceptible light appeared ahead. It wasn't the warm glow of a candle or the harsh beam of a flashlight. It was a sickly, phosphorescent green, pulsing faintly, like something alive and diseased. It seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, casting a ghastly pallor on the rough-hewn tunnel. As I drew closer, the green light grew stronger, illuminating the space around me. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. My eyes struggled to adjust, taking in the horrific panorama. The walls here were not stone, but a bizarre organic material that seemed to ooze and pulse with the same sickly green light. It was like standing inside a giant, diseased organ. Strange, calcified structures protruded from the floor and ceiling, resembling distorted bones or petrified roots. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet decay, now mixed with a sharp, acrid odor that burned my nostrils. In the center of the chamber, suspended by thick, rope-like tendrils of the pulsing green material, was a structure I recognized with a sickening lurch of my stomach. It was a miniature replica of my family home, not the dilapidated ancestral house I now stood in, but the modern, sleek design I had poured my heart into, the one that had burned to the ground. It hung there, perfectly rendered, but warped and distorted, its walls seeming to weep the same green light. I stumbled forward, my legs suddenly weak. The replica pulsed, a faint, rhythmic throb that vibrated through the floor. My family, trapped, my breath caught in my throat. This was the entity's core, its nest, and it had built a monument to my greatest failure, my deepest wound. How did I even begin to fight something that had woven my guilt into its very structure? I took a shaky breath, the scent of old wax and dust filling my lungs. The fear was still a live thing coiled in my gut, but something else had joined it now, a steel-hard resolve. This wasn't just about my grief anymore or the fire that took everything. This was about them, my family, and whatever horror they had woven into the very bones of this house. I pushed myself up from the cold stone floor, my knees protesting. My eyes, still stinging from unshed tears, scanned the chapel. Not as a sanctuary, not as a prison, but as a structure, a blueprint. My architect's mind, dormant for so long, began to stir, shaking off the fog of despair. The chapel wasn't just a room, it was a carefully constructed space, its proportions precise, its materials deliberate. The heavy oak doors, the thick stone walls, the vaulted ceiling, they all spoke of containment, of purpose. Why here? Why this chapel? It was the heart of the house, the deepest point. And then it clicked, a terrifying, crystalline realization. This wasn't a chapel built for worship alone. It was a lock, a vault. My ancestors hadn't merely built a house, they had constructed a cage. And whatever they'd trapped inside, whatever entity had been feeding on generations of guilt and sorrow, it was trying to break free, or perhaps it was free, and this chapel was merely its anchor, the point of its strongest tether. The flickering altar candles suddenly dipped, their flames shrinking, then flaring wildly as if a great gust of wind had swept through the enclosed space. But there was no draft. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. A low hum vibrated through the floor, rising into my teeth. It was a sound I'd come to recognize, the prelude to its manifestation, the rumble of its hunger. My hands moved, almost instinctively, tracing the lines of the chapel. The altar, the pews, the very structure of the walls. I saw the subtle discrepancies, the small, almost imperceptible flaws in the masonry that an unburdened architect would have corrected, but which now seemed deliberate. A series of small, recessed panels, almost invisible, ran along the base of the altar. Not decorative, functional. My fingers brushed against one, feeling a faint indentation, a faint seam. This was it. A trap built for something that now thrived. And if they built it, I, their descendant, an architect myself, could understand it, could perhaps even dismantle it, or more likely reinforce it. The hum intensified, becoming a low growl that resonated in my chest. They were levers, I realized, not simple latches but interlocking mechanisms designed to shift something deeper within the chapel's foundation. I pressed the first panel, my heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel its anger now, a tangible pressure in the air pushing against me. It didn't want me touching its cage. It didn't want me understanding its prison. Not words, just a sound like dry leaves scraping across stone. Mine. I ignored it, my fingers searching for the next panel. The second one was harder to find, concealed beneath a loose piece of mortar that flaked away under my desperate touch. Another click. This time, the low growl returned, stronger, rattling the very bones of the chapel. My breath plumed in front of me. I could see the outlines of my own trembling hands in the faint light. It stretched, a silent scream of pure malice. I could feel its gaze, heavy and possessive, but I wouldn't give it that satisfaction, not anymore. My resolve, though fragile, held firm. I found the third panel. This one was hidden beneath a tarnished brass plaque dedicated to the founders. Irony, bitter and sharp. As my finger brushed it, a jolt of static electricity snapped through me. It pressed against me. An invisible weight, trying to force me away from the altar. The pressure was immense, crushing. I gasped, my lungs burning, but I held my ground. Mine. My fingers found the indentation, felt the resistance. I pushed, gritting my teeth, every muscle screaming. The stone groaned. A deep, grinding sound vibrated up from the floor, shaking the entire chapel. The altar itself seemed to shift, a faint tremor running through its heavy stone. With a final, desperate push, the third panel clicked into place. The altar candles had extinguished, leaving me blind, disoriented. The crushing pressure intensified, wrapping around me like a shroud. I couldn't see the entity, but I could feel it everywhere, a suffocating presence. What had I done? Wrench, a section of the altar stone grated inward, a sound like ancient bones grinding against each other. The tremors intensified, shaking the very ground beneath my feet in the chapel during lockdown. Altar candles' only light. Dust, thick and choking, billowed from the newly formed gap, catching the faint orange glow. The opening wasn't large, not yet, but it was enough. A raw black void yawned where solid stone had been moments before, exhaling a smell that clawed at my throat, damp earth, something metallic, and an undertone of decay so profound it tasted of forgotten time. I stumbled back, my breath catching. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, a tangible weight. The candlelight, which had been steady moments ago, began to flicker wildly, dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling, making the carved saints on the walls appear to writhe. I watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the opening widened further, slowly, agonizingly, until it was a narrow doorway, just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. A low hum started, vibrating in my teeth, in my skull. It wasn't a sound from the chapel, but from within me, a resonance with the raw, exposed space. My hands, still grimy from the dust, began to tremble uncontrollably. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that the entity was there, waiting. It had been drawing me here, to this place, to this moment. This was the heart of it all. A wave of despair, sudden and overwhelming, crashed over me. Images flashed through my mind. The flickering flames consuming my home, the smoke-filled corridor, the desperate, unheard screams. My children's small, still forms, the architect's blueprints, the flawed design, the guilt. It wasn't just memories, it was the feeling of those moments, amplified 1,000 times, each one a blade twisting in my gut. The entity wasn't showing me memories, it was making me relive them, taste the ash, feel the searing heat, the crushing weight of my failure. I sank to my knees, gasping, the air suddenly too thin to breathe. My muscles seized up, locking me in place. I built it. I killed them. I let them burn. The voices weren't external, they were in my head, insidious and relentless, echoing my deepest fears, my most agonizing regrets. They promised an end to the pain and oblivion if I would just surrender, just let go, just stop fighting. But something stirred within me, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. It was the determination that had driven me to this chapel, the desperate need for answers, for truth, for an end to the haunting. My family deserved more than my surrender. I wouldn't let this thing consume me, not after everything. I pushed back against the crushing weight of the grief. No, the word was a silent scream in my mind. I don't get me. Ice crystals formed on the stone floor around me, glistening in the candlelight. I could feel the entity's fury, a desperate, ravenous hunger. It was trying to break me, to devour my last shred of hope. I forced myself to stand, every muscle screaming in protest, my legs like lead. My eyes burned, but I wouldn't close them. I stared into the black opening in the altar, into the source of the malevolence. I wouldn't cower. I wouldn't let it win. This wasn't just about my guilt anymore. It was about reclaiming myself, reclaiming their memory from this parasitic horror. The chapel groaned around me, the stone walls vibrating, threatening to collapse. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, dust raining down in thick sheets. One of the stained glass windows, depicting a serene shepherd, suddenly shattered inward with a sharp report, scattering colored shards across the floor. The entity recoiled, a shiver running through the air, a faint, almost imperceptible withdrawal. My defiance, my refusal to yield, had struck a chord, a weakness. It hated the resistance. It thrived on despair, not courage. It needed me broken. And I was not broken, not anymore, not hope. Not yet, but a strange clarity. The hum died down, replaced by the faint, rhythmic drip of water from somewhere deep within the newly opened passage. I stood there panting, my entire body aching as if I'd run a marathon. The air still carried the metallic tang, but the taste of decay was fading. I walked to the opening, drawn by an irresistible pull, waiting. What had I just faced? What had I just survived? And what did this newly opened passage promise to reveal? I had pushed through the entity's assault, but the house, this chapel, was irrevocably scarred, and I was forever changed, stripped bare of my illusions, but also forged anew in the crucible of my grief. What lay beyond this threshold, in the heart of this ancient home? The altar candles themselves guttered, the flames shrinking to pinpricks, then flaring wildly, throwing grotesque, dancing shadows across the stone. The shriek abruptly ceased. A vacuum. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound, but a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against my eardrums. My lungs, still aching from the frigid air, struggled for purchase. I gasped, a ragged, desperate sound in the sudden quiet. It was gone, or at least it had retreated, but the stain of its presence remained, a psychic bruise on the very fabric of the chapel. I pushed myself up, my knees protesting with a dull ache. My hand, still clenched around the old iron key, trembled. The key to the crypt, to the family's secrets, to my own damnation. I looked at the altar, at the flickering candles. They burned steadily now, their light weak against the encroaching gloom, but steady. A fragile beacon. What had I done? Or more accurately, what had it done? Had my defiance, my refusal to be consumed, simply driven it back? Or had something deeper shifted in the ancient currents of this place? I moved towards the altar, my steps tentative, each one echoing too loudly in the vast space of the chapel during lockdown, altar candles only light. I ran my fingers over the rough-hewn stone of the altar. The air still carried the faint, cloying scent of something ancient and disturbed, like unearthed earth and dried blood. My family, the house, the fire, my guilt. It all crashed down again, a wave of familiar grief, but this time it felt different. Not a drowning, but a surge. I had faced it. I had stood against the thing that fed on it, and I was still here, broken perhaps but not consumed. The entity had thrived on my guilt, on the unresolved trauma, on the secrets that festered in the foundations of this place. But I had withheld the final piece, the surrender it craved. I had chosen to live, even if it was a life scarred by loss. The realization settled over me, not like a sudden revelation, but a quiet understanding. The entity wasn't just a monster, it was a mirror. By refusing to break, by choosing to confront the source of my pain rather than succumbing to it, I had, perhaps, starved it, or at least shown it that I was no longer an easy meal. My defiance had been an unexpected weapon. But what did that mean for the house, for me? I walked the length of the chapel, tracing the outlines of the cold stone arches. The faded frescoes on the walls depicting scenes of piety that felt profoundly ironic now. It was a tomb, a prison, and a sanctuary all at once. Selling it would be an act of betrayal, passing the burden onto someone else. Destroying it, burning it down as my own home had burned, felt like a surrender to the very forces I had fought against. But living here, alone, in the constant shadow of what I had faced, could I truly find peace within these walls? The memories, echoes of the entity would always be here. They would always try to creep back to test the boundaries of my resolve. It would be a constant battle, a lifelong vigil. I knew this. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a living testament to generations of my family's choices, good and terrible, and I was the last architect of its fate, the last guardian. My gaze drifted back to the flickering altar candles, their small flames defiant against the vastness of the chapel. They were not powerful, but they were persistent. They offered light. I stepped out of the chapel, closing the heavy doors behind me with a soft thud that reverberated through the silent corridors of the house. The gloom outside was even deeper, broken only by the thin slivers of moonlight filtering through the high, grimy windows. The house breathed around me, a presence I had once feared but now felt, observed. Not malevolent, not entirely, but waiting. I couldn't run. Not anymore. I had run from the fire, from the guilt, from the truth of my family's past, and it had only led me here to the heart of it all. I had faced the monstrous reflection of my own despair, and I had somehow survived. The house would remain, but it would be different. I would not let it feed again. I would find a way to honor the past without being consumed by it. I would turn the house into something else. A place of remembrance, yes, but also a place of healing. A place where the light could truly enter, not just in flickering candlelight, but in open windows and shared stories. It was a daunting task, an undertaking that would consume the rest of my life, perhaps. It filled me with purpose. A fragile purpose, yes, built on the ashes of my past, but purpose nonetheless. I would learn everything I could about the entity, about my family's methods, about how to truly seal it away, not just temporarily retreat from it. I would become the keeper, the chronicler, the one who finally broke the cycle. Just the quiet hum of an old structure, settling. Could I truly live with this fragile piece?